隐性知识对于团队、企业究竟有何益处？管理隐性知识的方法又有哪些？本次直播将为您解答这些疑惑。特邀嘉宾 Keith 教授是澳大利亚最大电讯公司 Telstra 前知识管理官，也是墨尔本知识管理领导力论坛创始成员。他将重点介绍自己过去的20多年里，通过与客户的合作以及具体实践所尝试的多种隐性知识管理方法，与大家探讨这些方法为当今的知识管理工作者带来的益处。4月26日16点30分，私信预约直播，也可扫描二维码，观看更多关于隐性知识管理的实践案例。
各位朋友，大家下午好。欢迎各位参加由 Mr.Keith 蒙科和组织隐性技能管理全球智库 GO-TKM 联合主办的组织隐性技能管理大师系列讲座。今天是第24场，由来自澳大利亚的 Keith De La Rue 先生主讲。他今天将跟我们分享他眼中的隐性知识。首先，让我们来认识一下今天的演讲嘉宾 Keith 先生。Keith 先生他是知识管理、沟通、项目管理和领导力方面的专家和资深顾问。他是澳大利亚最大的电讯公司 Telstra 以前的知识管理官。今天他也将跟我们分享他在 Telstra 知识管理工作方面的经历以及一些感悟。他同时也是墨尔本知识管理领导力论坛的创始成员，是 Knowledge Consulting 的首席顾问，也是门萨顶级智商俱乐部的会员，也是维多利亚大学的客座教授。今天活动的主办方是 Mr.Keith 蒙科以及 GO-TKM。蒙科是源自1981年，是企业导师技术和组织隐性技能管理的全球知名教育咨询品牌。蒙科的总部在比利时布鲁塞尔，全球有近600名专业顾问，在41个国家和地区为跨国公司、国际组织以及政府机构提供组织隐性技能萃取和企业导师传承相结合的培训以及咨询服务。那 Mr.Keith 中国是在国内市场开展企业导师制以及组织隐性技能管理的培训和咨询服务。我们同时也提供欧洲导师与教练协会认证的导师课程，是欧洲导师与教练协会受证的中国唯一导师服务机构，也是国际职业导师协会在中国的独家授权合作伙伴。我们同时也是组织隐性技能管理全球智库的理事单位。那组织隐性技能管理全球智库 GO-TKM 是注册在比利时布鲁塞尔的非营利性国际智库。我们智库成立的目的是为了推动组织隐性技能管理在全社会的运用，推动人类的高效率学习。好，现在我们把舞台交给我们今天的演讲嘉宾。Now let's warmly welcome Mr. Keith.
Hi, thanks for the opportunity to speak about tacit knowledge here at GO-TKM. Before I start, I'll just mention that the slide pack I'm using here, in a number of points, I have some references. They're inserted as links in the bottom left corner of the slides and are grayed out, so you won't read them on screen, but you'll be able to follow those links from the slide pack itself. So just to give you an overview of what I'm talking about in this session, I'll just start with a brief introduction to myself. I'm then going to talk a bit about my experience in knowledge management with the system we developed that we call the KM Toolkit. That itself is giving an example of the work I've done with tacit knowledge. But what I want to move on to then is a number of observations I've made over the years of different ways in which different people and organisations have dealt with tacit knowledge. I'm going to summarise that at the end of the session with some reflections based on what I have covered. So to start with, just to give you a bit of background about myself, I have been based for my career pretty much in Melbourne, Australia, but for the last couple of years, I now live about an hour's drive to the northwest of Melbourne at a very small spot called Blackwood. I spent 35 years of my career working for Telstra, Australia's major telecommunications company. But over that time, I worked in a number of different roles, both in telecommunications technology, but also in IT. Spent some time in the business and enterprise sales force as a technical and business consultant. But my last role in Telstra, I spent 8 years in knowledge management, and that's where I'm drawing some of my presentation from. Since then, I've spent another 15 years working as a consultant, but also as a sessional lecturer and tutor in a range of fields. So my main experience has been obviously in KM, but also in communication, project management, leadership, and related roles. That's included some learning and development roles as well as formal education. So just to tell you a bit about the KM environment that my team at Telstra was using. We're in the environment, as I mentioned, where we're working with business, enterprise and government customers of Telstra. The team that I was working in and was leading for some of that time was located, as you can see in the centre of the slide there, as part of the business and enterprise sales force. But where we started, there were some specialist sales teams closely involved with our team. And our role was about working with the product and marketing teams and finding a way to express their knowledge and information to the sales force in such a way that they could then make sense of that dealing with their business customers. The scales we're working with were thousands of business customers, hundreds of products, and worked with various segments of the sales forces from time to time. Some of those were people on the road meeting with their enterprise customers face-to-face. Some were desk-based and talking to customers by telephone. But one of the main driving forces for this was at a time when the business telecommunications market was becoming far more reliant on data and the internet. So there was some new technologies that the business sales force people were previously unfamiliar with. So a key part of our role was to aid in that education. And that meant working closely with the products and marketing team. Some of us in our KM team had a more technical background. Many had a background in education or in sales. And we worked together as a coherent team to use quite a wide range of tools to get that content out to our target audience, the business sales force. So the toolkit approach we used, we were across all of the different ways you can express products in this situation, services and solutions. And the main part of what we did was to develop a standardized toolkit. I think one of the things we did that I'm still not seeing done a lot today is worked with content, as in document management. We worked with communications, online web-based media, and also with training, online training, but also face-to-face training. The whole aim of what we did was not to be put into some particular silo in terms of organizational structure, but to ensure that we had an informed audience using whatever tools made sense. And we developed a range of media over that time and modified it as we went based on feedback from our audience and also working with the product managers and marketers who provided the knowledge and the content to make sure that at all times we were adequately getting the information out to the right people at the time they needed it. So I'll refer back to that a little bit, but what I'm going to cover now, based on that and a number of other things that I've seen over my time in my career, is just some observations on how we work with tacit knowledge and some of the challenges relating to that. I must say I'm using a very broad definition of tacit knowledge here. I'm not using an academic distinction between different types of tacit knowledge. I'm just looking across the whole broad range of that. And I think one of the aspects that I find important here is in one of the models of training, refers to a number of steps that we go through when we learn something. And the one I'm most interested in is that level of unconscious competence, the fourth step in that process, where we have learned something, we know it so well that we do it without thinking about it, which means that we are actually unaware of our tacit knowledge once we become an expert in that field. David Snowden, I think, represents this very well in one of his rules for tacit knowledge, and I believe you've already heard from David here. And his statement, "I only ever know what I know when I need to know it," is critical. If we're going to work with tacit knowledge, we need to develop the environment in which people need to access their tacit knowledge to know what it is that they know. So let's have a look at some of these observations. One of the ones we struck in our KM team at Telstra was that many of the product managers and marketers and other subject matter experts we worked with were often accused of hoarding knowledge. The feedback we frequently got from the sales force was that these people are just hanging on to their knowledge. They don't want to let us know too much about it because they must be afraid that they'll lose their position if they share too much knowledge. The frustration the salespeople had with this was they could never get hold of the product managers. They tried ringing them up and they wouldn't answer their phone. They would leave voicemail messages and either they wouldn't reply or their voicemail box was full. They wouldn't reply to emails. When we talked to the product managers about this, their talk wasn't so much that they were afraid of being redundant. They were really complaining about how many salespeople just kept annoying them all the time. The interesting thing we found when we talked more to these people was that they wanted to preserve their knowledge not because of any fear, but because they were worried that if the salespeople got some of their knowledge and didn't really properly understand it, they may actually start selling products to customers that then wouldn't work properly because they weren't properly set up. So what they were more worried about was their loss of reputation or the fact that their product would suffer out in the marketplace. So our approach then was to say, well, if we can work with you in such a way that we can present this information in a format that you're satisfied with, but most importantly, gives the salespeople what they really need to know to sell each product correctly, would you feel more comfortable with that? And not only were they keen on that, but we also got the feedback that, well, if we can do this and get that information made available for them to use whenever they need it, we'll probably get less phone calls and less annoyance from the sales teams. So that then became quite a successful approach. One of the other techniques we did was seeing that some salespeople were much more successful than others. So questions are being asked, well, what is it? Is there something that these people are doing that others need to know more about so they can be more successful at sales as well? So we started doing some interviews of salespeople after successful sales. And in one particular incident, there was a major sale of some new telephone system to a large company. And most of the standard questions that were being asked, what was it you did that helped win this major sale? And the salesperson could not give a direct answer. However, as the interview moved on and more questions were asked, in an aside when answering another question, the salesperson said that he was actually on site with the customer over the entire weekend when the cutover of the new equipment took place and had guaranteed when he made the sale that was what he would do. So our interviewer then said, well, do you think maybe that may have helped you win the sale? Oh, I hadn't really thought about that. Tacit knowledge. So our approach from then was to then think about, well, what other questions should we ask to bring up this realization of what actually helped create the successful sale? Now, this interview approach I've seen used in other times and places, and there was one particular example of this I heard in a conference. This was from a presenter from a large organization in Asia Pacific. Their approach to doing a type of an exit interview was to use a similar approach, but they went perhaps a fair few steps further than we did. The approach they took was anytime any of their key subject matter experts were about to leave the company for any reason, particularly for retirement, they would actually spend a couple of weeks working with this person with a professional movie team and professional interviewers. They took some time familiarizing themselves with the subject matter area this person was involved in so they could craft a lot of careful questions. They then videotaped the interviews and had them broken down into smaller pieces, indexed, and made available to other people, so that for any one element of this person's subject matter expertise, that could be made available for other people. If using this sort of process, I would imagine you could also then have transcripts of the video. I don't know any other detail of how that worked out, but that was quite successful at the time. But thinking about exiting an organization, there are challenges in how well you can handle extracting people's tacit knowledge at the time they're leaving an organization. If people leave abruptly, you obviously don't really have much chance to access that. So other approaches need to be taken. When I left Telstra myself, I had an option of spending a few weeks on pay, but moving out of my position, and I spent that time working with my team. I had already put a transition plan in place, a succession plan prior to this, and then I spent those last 3 weeks working more closely with my replacement and with the team to make sure that I had been able to hand over as much as I could of my role to them. But the challenge that I found with this is that in some organizations, if you want to actually keep an extra person on staff, you're going to have problems. You have issues like budget for their salary, but in the organization I worked in, there were also limits on the headcount, the number of people you could have on the team at any one time, so you could not have somebody there who wasn't an active worker because they'd be occupying a position. This also caused problems in finding appropriate replacements for them, managing how things worked, and how you actually organize this in any organization obviously would need to require close working with human resources to try and create situations where you can adequately manage an appropriate amount of time for handovers to take. One of the interesting features I find is hearing about how do we actually go about measuring the value of our knowledge. And this example of Martha Shelley is one that I find just an amazing example of how successful knowledge sharing can be for an organization. In the situation Arthur was working in at the time, he had a situation where there was a particular candy bar that the company he worked for was selling that was manufactured in 15 countries, sold in over 30, and they could basically sell as much of this product as they could make, $100 million per annum global sales. But each one of the factories had problems. So Arthur set up a community of practice across all the factories. He asked for permission to move people for 2 weeks to work together in one factory, which was actually in Turkey, to develop better solutions for their factory processes. This involved people who had solutions to some of the problems in one country, helping out people in another country that hadn't found the solutions, had overlapping problems and solutions. Arthur said that if he can be given an allowance for a $2 million investment to put these people together for the time to develop this, he would guarantee a return on investment. What actually happened in practice was that once all of the processes were put in place, everybody went back to their own factories, they were able to improve capacity by over 20%. So that meant they actually had a $20 million per annum sales increase. And one of the other benefits of this was that not only were they able to increase capacity and have a measurable increase in sales, the result was virtually instantaneous. It did not require time to build a new factory, which was one of the options that were being looked at before the community of practice was set up to address that issue. So this, to me, is one of the most outstanding examples of the value of knowledge and effective knowledge sharing. Communities of practice can be within an organisation, or they can be across organisations. One of the examples of a community of practice across an industry, I learnt in my role as one of the organisers of the Melbourne Knowledge Management Leadership Forum, a group I've been involved in for over 20 years. We had a presentation a while ago on a setup called the Victorian Pinot Noir Workshop. Pinot Noir is a wine grape variety, and what the Pinot Noir growers in the state of Victoria in Australia had discovered was that other areas of grape growing, Western Australia and New Zealand, were in fact becoming far more successful in the market than the Victorian producers were. So it was decided to set up a community of practice where all of the Pinot Noir growers could work together. This group is still in operation, and they work by having a get-together for a few days once a year and then communicating online for the rest of the year. The interesting thing is that these people who are meeting are actually competitors, but they were also more concerned about the fact that they had other competitors in other areas that they're all suffering from. One of the elements of grape growing and winemaking is that you can, in fact, have these people all sharing their wine production techniques, their horticultural techniques, all of these things, but still compete individually, because one of the major determinants in the finished product of wine is, in fact, the soil the grapes are growing in. And that is distinct in every vineyard. So this group was able to get together, share knowledge, and quite deep knowledge, in order to more successfully compete in the broader industry. Another aspect to knowledge management that there has been a bit of talk about recently is that many of the techniques that we use that we call knowledge management are in fact a knowledge push technique. By that I mean, if we build a database, we build a wiki, or we do podcasting, all of these things are things that we're pushing out to an audience, but then we don't have a lot of control over what the audience does with them. Yet in practice, many people in organisations need access to knowledge, like the sales people in my organisation that I've referred to. They need to know where to get the knowledge. Now, what research has shown is that, in fact, people usually are far more willing to get knowledge from people than they are from databases. So we need to consider what approaches we use for knowledge pull when we're looking at making access available to tacit knowledge. We can convert it to explicit and put it in a database, but that's not necessarily going to be the most successful. There was an example of making knowledge available in a pull approach some years ago by the organisation Lend Lease, a major company in the construction industry. Their system was called iConnect. Now, the way that iConnect worked was they got together a group of just a handful of people who were not chosen for being subject matter experts, but people who were chosen as excellent connectors. These were people that had a broad awareness of subject matter experts across the whole global company. They put them together into the iConnect group. And the way that worked then was that people who needed to have a problem solved in a company could contact iConnect. iConnect would then reach out through their network to find the right expertise somewhere else in the company and on somewhere else in the world, and then connect the experts with the people who had the challenge. By doing it this way, they found then people were able to talk to people, they could share their knowledge, and at the end of that, they could then document where that expertise was. And potentially you could build that into databases for future reference, but the main aspect of this was people connecting with people is a great way of sharing tacit knowledge, as similar connections in communities of practice. A much more personal level, one example of the challenges in tacit knowledge to me is, and I don't know how many of you necessarily had this experience of either learning to drive a manual car or teaching someone else to drive a manual car. This is a classic case of unconscious competence. Once you've got used to this, you operate the clutch and the accelerator in the car without thinking about it. It's totally an unconscious action. What I found teaching one of my daughters to drive and trying to explain, well, you put 1 foot on that and you lift your foot off that. What usually happens when somebody is learning in that environment is that the car stalls or they start kangaroo hopping. So I was teaching my daughter to drive in a fairly big open paddock, grass paddock. And she was struggling with it. And then I was trying to think of how can I better explain the actual process. And I actually got her to get out of the driver's seat, got back in the driver's seat myself, and actually operated the clutch and the accelerator to bring back to my conscious mind the actual process. It's not as simple as lifting your foot off the clutch and accelerating. It's a matter of lifting your foot off the clutch until you feel the clutch start to take up. You then increase the revs, lift your foot a bit more off the clutch. And it takes some practice before that actually becomes a smooth and subconscious action. That's how tacit knowledge can work. Another subject that I find of great value is conversation. And again, I believe that David Gertin has already spoken here too. And one of David's favourite philosophers, when it comes to conversation, is Theodore Zeldin. And some of the aspects of conversation that David talks about and Theodore Zeldin has talked about is that when you bring people together in conversation, each of the people come in with their own thoughts, their own tacit knowledge. But if you openly engage in a conversation, you can actually generate whole new ideas. As Theodore Zeldin says, it doesn't just reshuffle what you both already know, or then, depending how many people in the conversation, it's actually creating new cards in the deck, new ideas. I've written an article about that is available through my website. The link's on that slide. But there are a number of aspects of conversation that we need to think about to actually get the right sort of conversation. There is a quote from Zeldin here. I will let you read that for yourselves on the slide. the thing is that conversation is intrinsically creative. In conversation, we transform facts, we reshape them, we draw new implications, develop new trains of thought. But we must be prepared to be open and to be able to change our minds based on the discussion in the conversation and other people's ideas. If you go into a conversation with a closed mind, you're not going to create anything new. You're going to be limited to what you've brought in. If we talk differently, life can be more interesting. David, of course, uses this model in the Knowledge Cafe. There are many other cafe approaches to knowledge sharing, but there are some of the same rules apply across them. You need to allow diverse conversations. In the Knowledge Cafe approach of David's, the whole aim is just for people to surface knowledge, using David's words. The idea that we each share our ideas around a table. After so many minutes, we get up, move to other tables, and the sharing continues. And ideas build up from previous ideas in the conversation. The cafe model of David's is similar to, and to some extent based on, an earlier concept of the World Cafe. The World Cafe is different in particular in that people actually take notes, and you can have graphic facilitation, a whole lot of ways of harvesting the ideas that are collected. I've been involved in another technique called the Pro-Action Cafe, which is similar to that, but where you actually progressively refine and develop a particular idea. It's a great way of developing new products or services with experts who can share their knowledge in this environment. So again, it's a matter of choosing the right conversational model to match your requirements. But one of the things that's critically important in all of these is to allow diverse conversations, to be able to develop ideas openly without them being restricted by predetermined concepts that people brought in with them. This is starting to talk about some of the concepts you see in brainstorming. And one of the big problems with brainstorming, and a great way to kill conversation, is if you have somebody in the group who is taking a dominant position. And this so often happens in organizations where we have a manager with a group of team members, and they say, let's do some brainstorming. Somebody mentions an idea, and the manager says, well, that idea will not work. Any more ideas? And as soon as any one person is put back in their place by a dominant person in the room, nobody is going to want to come up with any more ideas because they'll be afraid the same thing will happen. We often use post-it notes to brainstorm and put ideas up onto a board. There are ways of doing that that will actually help us get away from that dominant situation. If we go through an introduction and then get each person in the group to write an idea, one idea per yellow or whatever color note page, write down at least 6 ideas each before anybody even looks at what you're writing down. Then you ask people to come up one by one and put their ideas up onto the board without any discussion. This is done in total silence. This then avoids the step of people commenting on ideas and limiting ideas, because all the ideas are already written down and are put up on the board. The next step, the facilitator will then work with the team to go through and group the ideas together and develop the headings for those ideas. And again, that's done without discussing the merits of the ideas. It's purely done as a way of grouping the ideas together, and a similar approach can then be taken to prioritizing the ideas in such a way that it avoids the dominant person stepping in and overriding what's happening. This often will require a very good facilitator and or a lot of careful work with anybody in the room who is known to be likely to be dominant in advance. We need to be able to have equal access to sharing for the ideas to actually get together and be used and developed further with the group. Again, this is bringing tacit knowledge out into the open. And one of the other ways of sharing tacit knowledge is by telling story. By telling stories, we can actually, with the right type of story, put across ideas in a way that will then resonate with the experience of people listening. When we hear stories, well-told stories, there are hooks in them that we can relate to. Story can give us a personal connection. And one of the interesting things with story is that stories will trigger other stories. This is very much shown in the work that Sean Callahan and his colleagues have done at Anecdote. You can use story to collect ideas from people. This is often done in working with organisational health and safety. An interesting aspect of that is people quite happily tell stories about what actually happens, whereas if you go in with an OH&S audit with a clipboard, people behave the way that they think you want them to behave. People will tend to one-up each other with stories once they're in an open and non-threatening environment. This is the sort of thing you'll see particularly happen with people who go fishing. Somebody will talk about catching a fish, and somebody will say, oh, but I caught an even bigger fish. And then somebody will say, oh, no, mine was bigger again. This one-upping is called ditting. And this is a way of, once people become comfortable, stories triggering other stories. And what you're probably aware of is that by giving you these reflections of my experience, I'm basically telling you stories of my experiences and encounters as they relate to tacit knowledge. So what I'd like to do now is just summarise the ideas that are behind these anecdotes or stories that I've been telling you. Going back to my own experience, before you start judging people and how they share or choose not to share tacit knowledge, you need to first understand their personal motivations. You need to know what's driving that and address it appropriately before you're going to access the knowledge you need. In the other examples, if you're asking people in order to access their knowledge, you need to ask the right questions. You need to work through the different ways that you can ask a question that will trigger the answer that you're looking for. Obviously, having people working together is a way they will share tacit knowledge with each other. Whether that's in a community of practice environment, a job shadowing, or some other way in which people can share their activities, then they'll share their knowledge. From what I was saying about conversation, it is most important to bring diverse ideas together. One person's idea in one field of expertise will trigger somebody else's tacit knowledge in possibly an even totally different field. Obviously, the broader the network you build and the more people who know people, the better you're able to access tacit knowledge across an organisation, or in fact across multiple organisations. It's often important to revisit your own knowledge, as in the driver training example. Once you've got to that point of expertise established to the unconscious competence level, you may have to go back and work through, well, how did I get to this point, and how can I make sure somebody else can get to the same point? Practicing open conversation is important, where no one idea completely dominates all the other ideas in the room. To do that, you need to build a supportive environment, an environment where people can develop trust in those around them, and then we're far more willing to share their knowledge with others. They need to know that any fears they have won't be realised, whether it's fears of redundancy or fears of misuse of the knowledge. They need to have that level of comfort. And put all that together using stories to share your experiences and to connect with others is a critically important step. So I'd like to thank you for your time. I trust that some of the ideas that I've shared here may be helpful, and quite happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you for your share about what you know about Tacit Knowledge. And we have learned some phenomena about Tacit Knowledge and some models that for knowledge sharing, like conversation, telling stories, and also about communities of practice. Thank you very much. And now we come to the Q&A. If you have any questions, you can just unmute and ask questions or put them in the chat box. 非常感谢 Keith 先生刚才的分享。我们现在呢进入问答环节。大家如果有任何问题的话，可以现在提问，然后可以把你们的问题就是直接打在聊天框里，然后其他平台的朋友呢，我们的工作人员会看到，也会收集给我们的嘉宾。Okay, we have some questions from the audience on different platforms, and my colleagues have helped collected them, and I will put some of them in the chat box. Yes. Oh, great.
Right.
The first question, and I'll put them. I put it in the chat box.
Okay. Yes, thanks for that question. We included a number of elements in the standard toolkit. I mentioned in summary they covered training, communication, and content. So we had a document library that was the heart of that. We used the available technology of the time to provide a service that worked pretty much like a podcasting technique by making some audio recordings available on demand to people subscribing to them. We organised online learning tools, face-to-face training, which was very focused on what the salespeople needed. It would be a very brief 1-hour presentation, and then we would have the salespeople role-playing, selling the product that was being talked about. We had an online web presentation that ran for 15 minutes, followed by questions and answers on particular new products, web-based newsletter, and some professionally recorded audio and video tools as well. So yeah, quite a range. And the main thing was that each 90 days we would review the toolkit. We would look at feedback, we would run surveys, look at hit counts and determine which tools are working well, and adapt that to suit the needs of the audience each 90 days to make sure we're always hitting the right spots for what was needed.
Thank you. 那第一个问题呢，是我们刚刚在分享中 ，Keith 先生他有提到一个标准的，就是知识管理工具包。那这个工具包它到底里面包含哪些内容？那这个工具包里面呢有很多的元素，它可能有涉及到培训，就包括线上的，也包括线下面对面的，也包括我们平常比如说在组织里的一些数据库的记录，还有内部进行的一些采访。还有播客还有这个新闻通讯，就是要求每个人都去订阅的，还有一些比如说像销售人员，我们会采取一些比如说线下面对面的一些访谈，还有是角色扮演，还有一些线上的就是这样的是讲座这样的培训分享，比如说50分钟的时间，然后其中呢也包含这个问答环节，那主要呢是涉及到像新产品、新服务以及解决方案这方面的内容。那方法有很多，但有一点是要注意的是，对于这些方法，我们会在每3个月，就是大概90天的时候进行一个回顾，因为我们需要看，就是我们这个知识的接受者，就是我们的员工，他们的对这个知识分享的一个反馈，那我们会进行一些，比如说问卷调查，然后去分析是哪些方法它的效果比较好，就哪些更能满足我们这个受众的需求。Thank you, Keith. 那么大家还有
I can share a link with you to a book chapter that I wrote about how we set up that standard toolkit. I'll put that in the chat shortly.
Yeah, that'd be great. 那 Keith 先生呢，等会儿也会跟我们分享一个链接，就是关于这个工具包的。那大家有需要的话，我们也会分享给大家。Okay, the second question.
Yes, thank you for that question.
Yeah, I'll translate it first. 那第二个问题呢，就是说我们前面分享中提到，就是我们专家他要离开组织、离开公司的时候，可能要离职了。那我们当时组织内可能采用了一些方法，像离职访谈、离职交接这样的形式，然后去获取这个专家的隐性知识。那这个是针对他离职的时候做的。那如果是日常情况下，我们组织该如何去获取我们专家的隐性知识 ？Please.
So there are many possible ways to do that. In my experience, I've not seen one that I'd say is perfect in all cases. So one of the challenges is, as I did say, people prefer to get knowledge from people. To get them to access recorded knowledge that others have left behind is always challenging. You can set up databases, content libraries. I mentioned in the presentation recorded videos that be catalogued. In my experience, what I've most often seen, apart from people wanting to talk to people, probably the best way is just to have search functionality and very effective search. I think what we are finding in the last 12 months or so, though, is the emergence of generative AI tools in this space. I think we've yet to see how that's going to play out inside organizations, but I expect that is very likely to become a very powerful solution once you have the knowledge recorded into an explicit form. If you can use AI tools to then answer questions, that may become a very powerful way to access that. Thank you.
Thank you. 那对于日常的这个隐性知识获取的话，我们可以就是首先这个方法的话，它没有说就是一个比较万能的方法，它可能有很多。那在我们 获取专家隐性知识的时候，我们也遇到了一些挑战。比如说，其实人往往会倾向于去从比那些可能记录下来的知识，人更倾向于说直接从这个人身上学到一些什么。那这个是我们一直就是要想克服的一个难题。那具体的方法，我们前面也提到过，我们可以就日常在公司里建立一些相应的知识数据库，像这样相应的这个内容管理，然后以及平时的一些采访，包括的一些录下来的视频、音频等等。那像过去就是最近我们也非常流行的就是生成性 AI 工具。我觉得这个工具呢，对我们其实获取这样的隐性知识获取也是有很大的帮助的，就是通过那些提问的方式，我们能够获取那样的隐性知识，然后并把这样的知识给记录下来，能够让它显性化。
I've just shared that link to the Knowledge Toolkit document on the chat for everyone.
Yes, I'll share it with our audience. 我们 Keith 先生他刚刚已经分享了那个关于一个知识转移的一个工具包，我们那个稍后会分享给大家。Hi Darius, do you have any questions?
Hi there. Yes, thanks, Keith. Further, is a really good question actually about accessing tacit knowledge on a daily basis rather than just waiting until the expert is about to leave or retire. Well, another way to do it, further to what Keith has said, is to capture this know-how and lessons learned and so forth and put it into procedures and policies and checklists so that when people are doing their work, you know, they go maybe follow a process or go through a checklist, and within that checklist is some of that tacit knowledge that experts over the years have accumulated, like do this, don't do that, before you do this, make sure you do that. So that's another way that tacit knowledge could be accessed on a daily basis and shared. And as Keith mentioned, how to use generative AI and the GPT engines as another way of accessing documented know-hows is very interesting, but it's very early days yet. So thank you.
Yes, about generative AI, it's worth exploring further. Thank you for complimenting. 刚才我们 Darius 他就是也做了一个补充，就是关于如何就是在日常情况下获取我们的就是专家的隐性知识。就除了我们 Keith 刚才提到的，我们还可以就是说在我们日常情况下，我们把专家的知识以及他们就是多年积累下来这样的经验、这样的教训，然后把他们记录下来，比如形成公司的这个比如说流程手册里面，比如规章制度里面，然后形成一个比如说一个列表、一个检查清单的样子。这样我们在做日常工作的时候呢，我们可以先看一下这个清单，然后看一下里面可能就是告诉我们应该怎么做，然后又不应该去做哪些事情，就是基于别人的经验，然后我们去习得一些就是一些我们应该做的，还有就是不应该做的，这样避免我们可能说再次犯错，然后去引用一些好的方法。包括刚才的这个生成性 AI 工具呢，也是非常有趣的，这个也值得我们进一步探讨。
Yes, I've just put a link on the, a comment in the chat that one of those techniques that Darius was talking about is business process guidance. I'm not sure of the current status, but there was a company a few years ago, Panviva, with a product called Support Point. And the process they used there was to, yes, build in existing knowledge in an explicit form, but into the actual guidance steps that, for instance, call center operators would work through in the form of scripts. So to be sensitive to exactly what they were doing, if they were selling a product, it would come up with information on that product and the sales process, etc. So yes, that was a technique that has been quite effective. I've not seen recently where that's at the now and which products are doing that sort of purpose, but yeah, that's one good way to do that.
我们把就是我们一些隐性知识把它记录下来。之前也有公司有过这样的就是很好的案例，就是他们有一个业务流程指南，然后把就是相应的流程都记录下来，然后供就是后续的我们人沿用。啊，不知道这个现在还就是有没有，但大家可以去找一找。There is a comment from Michelle in the chat.
Yes, so Michelle, thank you for that. And yes, look, I think that's one thing I probably didn't go into in this presentation. I may have briefly mentioned the concept of mentoring or coaching. Absolutely, very important. The thing I did mention was that to rehire retired experts, yes, a great technique. But as I did say, that sort of approach is one that many companies find challenging in terms of how you manage the actual contractual arrangements or the HR processes. But I think it's one that's critically important. So I'm glad to see that somebody is actually taking a positive step towards that. Again, people sharing with other people within the work environment, that is a time when the tacit knowledge can actually be triggered when you're actually doing the job. And that's when people will be more aware of it, bring it from the subconscious to the conscious, and talk to the junior people as they go through the job.
Michelle 就也是分享了一个，就是他一个真实的案例，就是他们公司也是就是在公司内部有一个就是日常的导师辅导计划，他会聘用这些已经退休的专家，然后作为顾问，然后在就是公司里提供给年轻的员工，然后提供一个导师辅导，这样呢，这也是一个日常的比较项目啊。通过这个不同的项目，那其他的员工呢可以向这些就是专家已经退休的顾问，然后向他们学习，这是一个非常好的方法。
It's worth bearing in mind that I was involved in a knowledge capture program, and we had experts who had retired, and some were in their 60s, 70s, and even some experts in their 80s. And you know the expression, if you don't use it, you lose it. Even if people aren't suffering from mental deterioration because of age, as soon as you come out the workplace, how you remember things starts to deteriorate quite quickly. It happens to everyone, and it's the same as like learning a language. If you're out of the country or you're not speaking the language, you quickly forget it. And also stories and lessons learned get distorted and changed over time. So if you are hoping or planning to use recently retired experts, get them back as soon as possible, just because of the natural way that memories and experience and knowledge change as you get older and as you are away from a company. And that could be easily to do with the same applies with experts when they're younger as well. It's not necessarily to do with old age, it's just to do with being out of the environment and how what you remember changes very quickly when you're no longer in that working environment.
对于我们这些离职的专家呢，我们就是也有一个，因为专家可能离职的时候，有的人比如说渐渐大家60、70、80了，然后这样会就是经历一个可能记忆的衰退的一个过程，因为我们人都是这样的，就像我们学一门语言，如果你长时间不使用的话，就会忘记。那我们如果要获取这些专家知识的话，我们可以就是在他们要离职或刚离职的时候，可以尽快的就是跟他们合作，然后把这些他们的这个知识经验把它留下来。Thank you, Darius.
I see we have one other comment there from Sunshine Zoo.
Yes.
The benefit. Yep. So looking at the benefit that experts would get from sharing their tacit knowledge, very good question. And what I found is that the situation we were in the Telstra example, some of the experts there felt annoyed and frustrated by all the questions they're getting. But when we set up an environment where we help them to express their tacit knowledge, to put it in more explicit form, but in a particular structured format. They were always very happy to oblige. I think experts, if they're in an environment where they feel that they can trust that their knowledge will be used appropriately, are more than happy to share. I know I've always been happy to provide mentoring to other people because it's a way after a long, particularly for older people, where you've built up a lot of knowledge over time, you feel the need to give back something to help other people. And yeah, I think that it's usually not too much of a struggle getting people to share in the right environment, given a trusting environment and an open environment.
那我们还有一个问题就是，专家他能够从隐性知识分享当中获得什么好处？而且我们该就是如何去激励这些专家去分享他们的隐性知识？那其实对专家而言，他们其实会被就是问到那些问题的时候，他们可能也会遇到一些困扰。那就是这个我们在前面的分享中也讲过。那我们就是作为知识管理人员，我们要做的就是能够去创造一种环境，就是营造一种环境，然后让专家就是表达他们的隐性知识，然后他们的这个知识呢，能以一种比较显性的，而且一种比较结构化的方式能够体现出来，就是让他们觉得他们的这个知识它是就是形成一个体系化的，并且他们觉得就是能够就是信任你们。就是我的这个知识我分享出去了，但是它呢是被很好的利用了，就是说并没有被就是滥用或者说错误的使用。那我们专家因为还有就是因为大家就是年纪越来越大，其实也会想着就是说能够说去回馈，就是可能向公司向社会有所回馈，这个呢也能够给他们带来一些就是一种有价值的这种感觉，就是有一种责任感，一种使命感，但是也一种就是感觉有一种收获，一种成就感。所以最重要的是我们能够就是帮他们就是营造这样的环境，然后让他们感觉到他们分享这样的知识是值得的，是能够被就是很好的利用的，就是说也就是适得其所的这种方式。然后对他们而言就是有价值有意义的。Thank you, Keith.
Thank you.
我们还有 Michelle 她也分享了一个概念啊，就是说关于这个隐性知识分享的，就是说 living library， 就我不知道真实的中文是怎么样说的，大概就是说像就是行走的图书馆这种意思，就是我们的数据就是数据一直能够留下来，然后还有个能够持续的被大家使用。有生命的图书馆就是我们的专家的知识都能够留存下来，然后我们后续的人也可以持续的使用，这是非常有益的。好，谢谢，非常谢谢。Thank you, Keith. Thank you very much for your sharing, and thank you, Darius. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Sansha, and thank you for all your questions. I think that's all for today's webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your good work translating, Icy. Appreciate it.
It's my pleasure, and thank you, and have a good night. .那接下来就是让我们看一下我们下周讲座预告。我们下周的讲座是在5月份，然后是由来自英国的 Stephen 先生，他要给我们分享的话题呢，就是标题是比较有意思的，说你以为你知道，但是你是如何知道的？那你知道的就是对的吗？ 我们非常欢迎就是感兴趣的朋友也参与我们的下一期讲座。大家可以扫右方的二维码，然后报名参加本次的讲座。那这里我们再跟大家分享一下，是我们即将在5月7号然后举办的商学院 MBA 职业导师交流沙龙。因为我们知道很多商学院都有这个 MBA 的职业导师计划，那我们也是为了就是帮助提升商学院 MBA 职业导师的这个辅导效果，以及帮助 MBA 同学实现快速的成长，那我们也是特地举办了这次沙龙活动，供大家分享和交流，也主要是面向就 MBA 的职业导师，或者是有志于成为 MBA 职业导师的朋友。那大家如果想进一步了解就是这次活动的议程的话，可以扫右方的这个二维码，然后也可以报名，然后加入我们，跟我们一起分享和交流。那我们即将在5月12号也要开启我们新一期的国际职业导师认证课程。那关于我们的这个职业导师呢，大家可能也会问，就是我们的这个导师他有什么特点？我们的这个导师辅导呢，它主要有5个特色。那首先第一个是我们导师会帮助学员明确发展的方向。那如果你方向错的话，因为结果就会没有意义，只有在你导师先帮助学员明确方向以后，然后再激励学员去挖掘学员的无限潜能，这样呢能够快速有效的实现目标。第二个是我们导师在帮助学员达成目标的过程中，也不仅仅是说完成一个就是事物的一个过程，推进事物的推进过程，同时也是帮助学员去提升他的能量状态。那第三个是我们导师要帮助学员，一个是既激活他一个外在的资源，可能比如说涉及比如说他的一些人脉啊之类的，然后同时也要激活他内在资源，可能是学员他自己没有意识到的自己本身具备的资源，能够很好的帮助他。第四个是我们的导师辅导成果，像 KPI、ROI 都是可以被有效的计量和比较的。那最后一个也是我们蒙科的一个特色，就是我们导师会具备一个技能，叫做组织隐性技能萃取技能。懂得隐性技能萃取的导师，他不仅可以去传承自己的经验和智慧，还可以萃取他人的这个技能、经验、智慧，然后帮助到学员。那我们的这个认证课程呢，是受到这个欧洲导师与教练协会 EMCC 认证的。那我们的这个认证证书也是在全球140多个国家通用的。那现在距离开班大概还有半个月的时间，我们也提供了一个限时优惠，可以就是扫这个二维码，然后具体了解。那我们也是先到先得，所以欢迎大家就是加入我们这个导师认证行列。最后我们跟大家分享一个我们即将在9月份举行的大型活动，是第2届组织隐形技能管理论坛。活动的举办地点是瑞士达沃斯。关于这次活动的具体信息，还有一些门票信息，大家可以点击这个最下方的这个网址 3w.go-TKM.org， 然后进一步了解。也可以就是扫码进入我们的这个达沃斯论坛报名意向群，然后跟我们进行实时的交流。好，最后非常感谢大家花时间看我们今天的讲座，我们也非常期待得到大家的反馈。关于大家如果有任何反馈的话，可以扫就是这个二维码，然后呢把大家的就是反馈意见可以留下来。好，今天的讲座就到这里， 非常感谢大家的参与，我们下期再见。伟东，Zoom 等一下关。